Hey, what's up? So today I want to talk about snare tuning, and this kind of came up because 2 weeks ago I did a band camp and I was putting a bottom head on a snare drum because it had torn out. It had been on the drum for probably over a year, and no one in the high school line really knew how to tune the snare. And then I thought, like, whoa, that's something that everyone should know how to do. So this video is really just about getting a good snare sound and doing it cost effectively. So I'm not going to reef the heads to crazy levels to get them to sound good, and it's also just about some basic maintenance things that are required for your snare. Okay, this is my 14 by 12 Pearl Championship snare drum. I got it on the Marching Percussion Marketplace on Facebook. It is about the most generic, run-of-the-mill drum you could have for your high school snare line. It's also the most generic, run-of-the-mill drum you could have for your world-class drum corps. Okay, so it's versatile. I'm going to take the head off really quick and then just put it back on because I don't have another head. I'm sort of going in a star pattern, but it really doesn't matter too much. So I just took the top head off and now I'm going to flip to the bottom. I'm taking the snare guts off. Just undo the knob, flick up, pull out, easy. Okay, this is what I end up with. So I've got my top and bottom heads. Here's my bottom rim. A couple of the lugs don't have the plastic brushes to hold them on. They're in the middle. There's my pile of lugs from the top head rim, and there's my snare. And then here's my other snare. It does that. Cool. That's why I took the bottom head off second, is so it didn't fall apart. Okay, now that I have both the heads off, I am going to clean the bearing edge off. Just make sure there isn't any grit on it. So I'm just using a paper towel for this, but a rag, anything will really work. At this point, you put a little bit of wax around the edge of the drum. And then just rub it on. That helps keep the rim hydrated and also keeps the head from being too frictionless on the rim. Okay, next up we're going to check out our lugs. If they're grody, hit them with a can of WD-40 or like paint thinner or something. If you're doing a bunch of them, let them soak, and then you're going to want to put on some grease. So I usually use like a lighter weight bike lubricant. That seems to work really good for me, but that's just so they don't rust in the sockets on your drum. Alright, we're almost ready to put our bottom head on. Right now I'm just cleaning the junk off the rim. Rods seem okay. I'll probably hit them with WD-40 and give them a new grease next time I do this. But you don't have to do it every time. There's already grease on the lug. You don't need more grease. Okay, so now we're gonna put the drum back together. So shell, make sure that the vents are aligned with the snare bed, because there's a little cutout where the snare bed is. And then head. I'm just reusing the one I just had on, so that's where it looks weird. Okay, so the head, the Remo logo is lined up with the badge. My drum doesn't have a badge, but that's just what I do. Other people do it different. Okay, and then bottom hoop. I like to pinch it around and make sure it's seated in the hoop. And you also want to make sure the cutout for the snare is aligned with the snare bed assembly. That's gotten me more than once. Now I'm going to go around the drum and get each lug seated. Okay, all my lugs are in now, and now what I'm going to do is evenly take the head and get it seated so it's flat on the rim. So I don't want like this or that. I just want it to be completely flat all the way across the surface of the head. And this is where a lot of people go wrong, is they don't get a proper seat, so all of a sudden their head's over here and it's not like smack in the middle of the drum. So that's not going to work out well when you try to bring it up to a high pitch. Now I'm going to get all of the lugs flush with the rim. And this is kind of where it starts getting nice to have two keys, because this is all just quick stuff. I'm doing opposites. So again, I'm just going till when it's flush with the washer on the lug. You can kind of start to hear the head move too when you get to the right spot. Okay, this next part is probably the next most important step in making sure that our head is laying flush and not sliding off the drum itself. And that's to go around and feel the edges. So I'm comparing these two heights and these two heights. And the snare bed generally will be lower, and then this distance you're measuring higher. In this case, this side over here is a little bit higher, so it means that if I started putting tension on the drum right now, this side would ultimately end up with more pull. So I'm trying to even everything out. And over here, okay, so this snare bed is about a 1/16 of an inch pulling down, so there's a bigger space here, so I'm just going to put a couple smaller turns over here. Yeah, good. Okay, so now my head is flush on the rim. Next up, I'm going to do 3 cranks or so, 180. I do the snare bed first, and then I go to the 4 next, and then these 4. So it's these, and then these. I do those as groupings. Okay, so here we are now. We can go up a little bit more. It's really common for people to over crank the top head when really you want it to be pretty elastic, and the bottom head is doing most of the work. So Drumcorps, I would take this up to a D5. For high school, realistically, I just kind of bring it up until it's got a nice resonant tone. One thing you'll notice is that my tensions around the lugs are different, or my pitches. So my resonant tone is pretty high, but these 4 lugs, so boom, 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 they are at the highest pitch, and then these are slightly lower, and then over the snare bed, we're at our lowest. So I match pitch. On those 4 lugs. It's really common for people to be like, oh, I want my head to be at a D5, and what ends up happening is these guys and these guys get over cranked because the snare bed is there, that little dip is there, so they have to pull the head harder and harder. It messes with the rim, and then the head tears out. The way I tune it, I probably do lose a little bit of resonance because the head is kind of at different pitches around the drum, but honestly I don't care because I'm saving like a lot of money on heads because it's not pulling out. Like when I was teaching drum corps for a few years, it was pretty common for me to only have like 1 head out of 8 snares blow out once a week, which is pretty untold of. And that was still tuning it up to a really, really high pitch. So I really think that keeping these lugs lower will save you a lot of money and not really affect your sound that much. Like not enough to justify 40 or 50 bucks for a new bottom head when you could just slightly sacrifice your sound and honestly no one will notice. Snare. This side goes up. Make sure it's seated in the slot, otherwise you won't be able to put it on. And then be really careful with the threads over here because it's really easy to strip them out on a pearl drum. So just something to be aware of. So now I'm seating the snare. I want a little bit of air between the snare wire and the head up until about here, because there's the snare bed, so the head is a little bit lower on either side. So this is about where I want the snare to contact. It's probably about a 1/64 of an inch, or like a guitar pick thickness on either edge. I tend to keep my snares pretty loose because you don't want them choking the resonance of the head, especially at a high school level when you're not playing like a crazy amount of notes. If it's too resonant, electrical tape right where the snare is hitting the head will deaden the snare response just a little bit. Okay, here we go on top head. I clean the room. Now I'm seating the head in the rim. Remo logo, those were the badges. Again, I don't have a badge. Then just get your rods going. Okay, everything's threaded. Now we go to finger tight. Again, sort of using a star pattern. I'm using an old head again because I don't have a new head, and honestly a lot of high school groups probably just have old heads kicking around, but this will still work with an old head as long as it isn't totally out of whack. I'm guessing this top head is at least a few years old, but it still does its job. If you have money for it, buy a new head though. I'm just looking for seat all the way around, make sure it's even with the head. Do this guy. Feels flush all the way around. Look at it, make sure it's seated in the middle again. Here's where I'm at. That nice Mylar sound, love it. Okay, I'm gonna try 3 180 turns around the top. That should get me pretty close. I really like doing this with 2 keys. You don't have to take your time getting it up to tension. I've changed plenty of heads that have gone on for shows across the country in like 5 minutes. Like, it doesn't matter. Little low. It's Kevlar. You don't have to go in a star pattern once you get it seated. A little bit more on the snare. bottom needs like one more crank. So I'm guessing that's like a C. It's definitely good to use, or if you're doing multiple drums, use an app and like make sure it's up to pitch. But for me that's good because I only have the one. Another thing, so if you're a solo player, keep the guts a little bit looser. You'll get more response, get a thicker sound. You can crank them up a little bit. With a little more dead if you have like 4 to 6 players, and then a little bit more if you have even more players than that, like 8. And then tape is also a factor. Okay, here's how it sounds. I don't want to hit it too hard because I have neighbors and I don't want to bug them, but so my top head is pretty low. If I push it, it's actually got some bend. So that's one thing that people mess up, is they crank it too high. It hurts your hands a lot. So the top head is actually usually lower than the bottom head. Okay, so definitely check that out. Make sure you aren't over cranking your top. The bottom, nice and resonant. But I'm definitely not over cranking my top. My bottom head is where most of the like snare oomph is coming from. My snares aren't over tight. My bottom head is tight. My top head is relaxed and it feels good to play. That's number one. It has to feel good. The rest of the tuning scheme can be manipulated on the bottom of the drum. With the top head, one thing you'll notice is that it really doesn't change or take a lot to change a lot. So when I get from that like mylar-y sound up to the actual pitch that I'm going for, I'm really only doing like a 1/16 of a crank or something. It's a really small number. So like that brought it up at least a step, and I just did tiny little cranks all the way around. So one really common thing is to overdo it once you get it past that initial stage of bringing it up to pitch. That got way longer than I thought it was going to. That's okay though. The moral of the story is bottom head, make sure that you're not over cranking on your snare bed, because you are going to get inconsistent pitches because of that little dip in the snare bed. And if you overcrank there, you're going to be out $50 months and months sooner when you buy a new head, and you're going to be like, man, these things are really adding up. Okay, so just don't overcrank them. Okay, go for the head pitch and not necessarily every lug pitch. Top head, a little bit lower, maybe like second or third, something like that. Once you get up to about 3 cranks around, at least on a pearl drum, start going in like 16th cranks, because otherwise you're gonna get this thing way too high and it's gonna feel bad to play on. It's gonna tear out. Okay, so there's really a small threshold between a plasticky sound and a good resonant sound with the top head. Snare guts, make sure you don't over tighten them. Okay, they're pretty tight. Like, to me they kind of feel like guitar strings. But if you're having like overly resonant snare guts, I'd really recommend putting a piece of tape on the guts before you resort to like just cranking the knob as tight as it'll go, and that can also lead to some hardware issues. So make sure you aren't being overzealous with the cranking of snares. I think that's about it. It's not too terrible once you get it. Just make sure everything's lined up right and evenly on the drum, and you should be pretty successful with this method of tuning. On a last note, I understand that there's a lot of different tuning schemes out there. This is just the one that worked for me. I use it at all my high school groups, and when I was teaching at Cascades from 2014 to like 2016, this was basically how I did the drums. So go and watch those videos. You'll probably notice they're a little bit lower than a lot of other groups, but it really does sound like the fullest to me, so that's kind of why I go for it. Yeah, if you have any other questions, write them in the comments. Thanks for watching. I understand this was a long video, but if you made it to the end, good for you. Yeah, alright.